This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello friends! In today's video, I am going to be reviewing some handmade watercolor paints that I purchased last month from Stoneground Paint Co., which is based and made in Canada. Stoneground does offer sets that have curated color selections, but I decided to purchase 6 individual half pans instead. I kind of made my selection based on colors that I find myself using pretty often, basically colors that I think would work for portraits, as well as a couple extras that I thought would complement each other. The first color here, Mayan blue, unfortunately got stuck to the paper wrapper, which made it a little tricky to remove, but after that, thankfully, you'll see that the rest of them came out of their wrappers quite easily. Each pan had a printed paint swatch on the outside label, and they were all individually labeled with the color name on them as well. And something that I think is worth noting about these paints is that the packaging was very minimal and these labels were just paper. And I think that's great because I think that going a more minimal packaging route is definitely more eco-friendly and doesn't feel wasteful in having all this excess plastic. So something that you'll notice is that some of the pans are filled right over the edge and some are not. And this is one of those little things that reminded me that these are handmade and hand poured. So small imperfections like this is something that I don't mind. And I will admit though that the ones that are filled right to the edge are very satisfying to look at. Since I purchased them individually, I needed something to keep them all contained together, so I went ahead and separately ordered an empty metal watercolor palette in this really cute coral color. And I think this can actually hold up to 12 half pans, so there is room for more paints that I can add in there in the future. But before I began painting, I decided to do something about the little bits of paper that were stuck to the Mayan royal blue pan because it just didn't look aesthetically pleasing and it was driving me crazy. So thankfully, it was pretty easy to remove. All I did was just wet a paintbrush to loosen up and kind of moisten the paper, and I was able to scrape it off, and voila, it was like brand new or like nothing ever bad happened to it. Then after that, it was time to finally swatch the colors. So color swatching, I think, is something that some artists find really tedious, but I actually really love doing it. I think it helps kind of get a sense of the paints, and there's something just very exciting about it. Often when I do color swatches, I put down a layer of clear water first, and then I'll lay down a concentrated amount of paint onto the wet part of the paper. And then after that, using a clean wet brush, I'll drag the paint out to create a gradient. This way we can get a better sense of the range of what the color can look like depending on, what it looks like at full strength and what it looks like diluted. And I find that in doing this, you can also see if there's any granulation or any other things to note about the paints per color. I believe when I picked out these colors, I purposely chose colors that were non-granulating or had very little granulation. And for those of you who don't know what that means, granulation is basically like a gritty looking texture that some watercolor paints can have after it dries. It can definitely be really beautiful and something that people specifically desire depending on the effect that you want. However, since I often paint portraits, I generally prefer not to have very many granulating colors unless it's for a very specific purpose. And since we were going for a more limited color palette here, I didn't want to grab any super granulating colors to start out with. As for the colors themselves, the first 5 you see me swatch here, I was so impressed by and instantly fell in love with them. A small amount of paint went a really long way for maximum saturation and color payoff. As you probably know, I'm a huge sucker for very, very vibrant colors. The final color, unfortunately, the Mayan royal blue, I was not quite as impressed with. Especially in comparison to the other colors, it just didn't seem quite as pigmented, and it definitely required me to work my paintbrush on the pan a lot more than the previous swatches. but I decided to reserve my full judgments until I actually started painting with them, because sometimes you never really know, and I did end up using a different paper for the swatches than I did with my actual painting here. So as per usual, I did the original sketch digitally on my iPad using Procreate. Then using my iPad as a lightbox, I traced the sketch onto some watercolor paper. Then with some washi tape, I taped down the edges of the paper onto a Masonite board, and I do this because I find that this just helps to prevent the paper from warping since I don't stretch my watercolor paper. But before we continue, I just want to quickly talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. So I'm the type of artist who creates both standalone illustrations as well as series of illustrations. So I was torn between whether I would display my work as single images on one page or if I'd have multiple pages. I was delighted to be able to easily create different sections to display my work in a variety of ways that would fit both of these requirements. As someone who doesn't know how to code, I really appreciate how intuitive the Squarespace templates are to use and how I can customize them to suit my needs. So if you're looking to upgrade or you're interested in kickstarting your year by building your online presence, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Going into this video, I knew I wanted to create a piece that would serve as the artwork for my January Patreon print. And so each month I usually pick some kind of theme so that my artwork print and then the artwork I make for the sticker can match. And so this month I decided to go with a theme of self-care. And I think that this theme was a nice reminder considering the state of the world right now and as well as beginning a new year. And of course, self-care looks different for everyone, but for me personally, I think my version of self-care is taking the time to pamper myself. And what I mean by that is, things like putting on cute makeup or painting my nails, doing a face mask, those kinds of things. Things that are maybe seen as frivolous, but in my eyes, I see it as a way of just treating yourself. And so in the spirit of experimenting with my artwork, I thought that it'd be fun to incorporate my usual portrait painting style. So as you can see, we've got a girl kind of looking into the mirror, putting on some mascara. But I also wanted to incorporate more graphic and minimal elements as well, and I think that it makes for a really fun and playful combination. So similar to how I approached the color swatches at the beginning of the video, when I began painting the skin, I first put down a layer of clear water to wet the paper, then having two different colors pre-mixed, one being the base skin tone and the other being a more warm version of it, I alternate between the two colors while the paper is still wet. I find that using this wet on wet technique as well as alternating between the two colors really helps provide a more even flat wash and for a more seamless gradient color shift between the areas of more blushy parts and the base skin tone. You also have to make sure that you work fairly quickly because if you let the paper dry before you actually finish laying down the paint, then that will result in some kind of blooming or just unwanted patchiness. As for what I used to create the skin tone, I believe it was just a combination of the red and the brown, so the Pyrrole red and Quinacridone red gold. Something important to note is that watercolor often looks more saturated and darker when it's wet. So you'll see that after I let that first layer dry, it looks significantly lighter than when I was originally painting it. I also think a key thing to keep in mind as well when you're painting with watercolors is to let the layers fully dry before you paint a new layer on top. This is how you slowly build up your values and saturation, and because watercolors are water soluble, you don't want to disturb the previous layer too much by painting while it's still wet. And because watercolors are a transparent medium, you want to go layer by layer so that you have more control over how you build the contrast. If you go straight in with the full strength of the paint, it's very difficult to lighten that area up later. Whereas a medium like gouache or acrylic, which is opaque, those ones you can go dark to light, light to dark, no problem. But watercolors are transparent. So if you try to use a light layer on top of a dark one, it's going to make pretty much no difference. Of course, this is something that you only need to be mindful of if you're rendering something that has dimension and shading like I am with this portrait. You'll see later on that with her hair, I just paint with a fairly dark shade right away, but this is only because I knew from the beginning that I didn't intend to have a lot of varying shades in her hair. And now that I've spent a little bit more time using these paints, I think I can safely say that for the most part, I really loved working with them. The only downside of these paints was the Mayan Royal Blue, which I will talk about in a little bit. And I will say that I didn't really get the chance to use the Magenta quite as much just because of the color palette that I chose. But judging from the swatch that I made at the beginning of the video, I'm sure that it is definitely on par with the other colors that I had used. So the Pyrrole Red, Quinacridone Red Gold, Hansa Yellow, and Cobalt Aquamarine were very intuitive to use. I was able to paint with them as I normally would without any issues or learning curves, and just like with the swatches, they were all very pigmented and super vibrant, and I really liked how they look on this illustration. And I definitely look forward to using them again in the future and possibly getting more colors from Stone Ground Paint Co. in the future to fill out this palette, since I purchased 6 and this empty palette that I bought fits 12. So I definitely think that it might be nice to just fill them out with either other handmade watercolors from other brands or just continue buying them from Stone Ground. But if you've seen my earlier video this year, the Art Goals 2021, I am trying to be a little bit more mindful of how much art supplies I'm purchasing, so it probably won't be for a while until I buy new watercolor paints. So as I mentioned, for the hair, I just wanted to keep it pretty simple and go for a dark flat wash with the Mayan Royal Blue. Unfortunately, as I had experienced when I initially swatched it on the other paper, it was not very pigmented, and I actually found it had a really strange consistency. I don't know if you've ever experienced this before, but sometimes when I use tubed watercolors and I go to squeeze the paint out, it's mostly clear rather than color. And basically, I assume what's happening is that the actual paint's pigment has separated from the binder, which results in almost like a slimy paint mixture because the paint that's being squeezed out is mostly binder as opposed to being pigment. And yeah, so the unbalance of the two makes the consistency really difficult to work with. And I find that, yeah, it just doesn't absorb into the paper very well, and it's very difficult to layer. So basically, the consistency of this Mayan Royal Blue reminded me a lot of that, which I found to be really strange because I had never experienced that before with a panned watercolor. And when I noticed this happening with tube watercolors, normally I try to use like a toothpick or something similar to try and remix the binder and the paint while it's in the tube. However, since this is a pan of watercolor, I'm unable to do that since it's completely dry. So a part of me is really hoping that maybe just like the top layer of the pan has this weird binder to pigment ratio, and that maybe the more I use it, the better the consistency will become. But another part of me thinks that maybe this particular batch just didn't get the right balance of binder to pigment. Or lastly, it's quite possible that this particular color is just supposed to be like this and I just don't really prefer it, or I'm not used to painting with this kind of consistency in a paint. But either way, I guess I won't really know until I try using it some more, and hopefully I can either come to like it or the consistency improves. So I will say, as you can see in the process here, I did go ahead and use watercolor for the line art of the eyes and for the hair, and I actually kind of cheated, I guess, in a way. I did end up using a black from a different brand to mix into the Mayan blue just because I was having such a difficult time getting a really dark shade with it. But with that all being said, 5 out of the 6 colors that I purchased were great, so I would definitely say that this was a really, really good purchase. And by the way, it's probably worth mentioning that I am not affiliated with Stone Ground Paint Co. in any way. I genuinely purchased these paints myself because back before the pandemic, I had been walking around in Gwartzman's, which is a local art supply store here in Toronto, and I had seen the Stone Ground paints there, and I didn't buy them when I was there, but I kept a mental note to check them out later. Then, many months later, when I was going about my holiday shopping, I thought that I would treat myself to a little gift too. And something that I was making the conscious effort of was to purchase almost all of my holiday gifts from small or independent artists and creators. And thankfully, Gwartzman's ended up having a Boxing Week sale, so it was the perfect time for me to pick up these Stone Ground watercolor paints, and it was an added bonus to be able to support not only a local art supply store, but also a Canadian art supply company as well. I think that there's something really special about things that are handmade, and I'm happy to say that this was a great first experience with using handmade watercolors. And yeah, that is the finished piece. If you're interested, pledge anytime between now and January 31st on my Patreon page if you would like this artwork as a print sent to your home. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!